So, that's my question. We're going to think about facts. So I want you to think about what is the most important fact about you. Maybe it's that you're English, or Irish, or Ukrainian, or a Hong Konger. Maybe it's that you're 5'10"-ish, depending on the hair. Maybe that it's you won an Olympic medal once. Maybe that it's you saved a life. You've got a minute. Maybe a little conversation with your next door neighbor if they're happy to talk. If they look like they're just thinking, then let them just think. But you might want to say, what's the most important fact in my life? Go! Okay. Gonna draw that together again. Draw us together again. If I can. Okay, so I don't know what you thought about, but it's probably one of two sorts of facts. And it's often really helpful to think about the two sorts of facts that there are kicking around. One, you might call a sort of scientific fact. It's actually the sort of default that we normally assume if someone just says, give me a fact. But let's think about scientific facts. Something that you could assess, something you could test, something maybe you could sort of experiment to find out and repeat. So I said I'm 5'10"-ish. You could measure me. You could come and check it. That sort of fact, yeah? This, surprisingly, maybe, contains milk. Now you might be a little bit surprised. This is a tin of milk. That's unusual. But you could test it. If you had the right bit of kit, you could take a little bit out. You could weigh it, check there's 400 milliliters in there with a volume thing. You could check that it is actually, in this case, coconut milk. Yeah? So that's the sort of scientific fact. I mean, one scientific fact is that there is gravity. And it always seems to work. And another fact, which I'm pleased about, is that tins are really quite strong. So scientific facts look a bit like this. You can assess them, you can test them, you can sort of repeat it. But not all facts are scientific facts. So I was born in Coleraine in Northern Ireland. You might just be able to see the white dot sort of up towards the top there. Now, I can't remember being born in Coleraine. I have a birth certificate, a document that sort of says it's true. You could ask my mum. Now, my mum's 92, but I'm sure she still remembers when I was born and where she was when it happened. She mightn't be around for very much longer to be able to, for you to go and have that conversation. So there's sort of some documentary evidence, maybe a witness. And maybe you can tell that it's a fact because of some of the consequences that roll down through history, like the weird bits of my accent. Yeah? So you might think, well, he might be born in Northern Ireland, because he says it particularly strangely. Or I might say that this painting was painted by a Dutch guy called Van Gogh, or Van Gogh, depending on whether you're American or English, and something much harder to say if you're Dutch. But I couldn't go and ask him, Did you do this? Because he's not there to tell me. But people have traced where it was, who bought it, who sold it, where it moved. So people can tell that there is evidence that convincingly tells you that Van Gogh painted that painting. Now, those sorts of facts, you might call them historical facts, and typically we know they're true, and they are just as true as scientific facts, but we know they're true through different ways. We know they're true because of the witnesses, because of documents, because of the consequences. Okay, so what if I told you that this was a Gorgosaurus skeleton? I was hoping no one would say that. Gorgosaurus, that's better stress. What do you think? Is it a fact or not a fact? How would you know? Now, you might go all sort of scientific-y on me, and you might say the way to know is to go and take one of the bones and maybe take a little sample off it and do a bit of carbon dating or something so you get some sort of age. Yeah, and then decide, oh yeah, it probably is. But what if it was a cheat? Like, I don't know if you know, but there was a dinosaur sold last week that was actually a dinosaur skeleton made up of 3 different bits of dinosaur skeleton and some plastic bones to make up the ones that were missing. So you could take one bone, but I mean, you can't test all of it. So how do I know that this is a Gorgosaurus skeleton? Well, for a start, looks like it might be. And that's a good place to start, isn't it? Yeah? But secondly, there is documentary evidence of how it got there. Like, it was found in 2018 in the Judith River Formation. I say that as if I know anything about that. But it's near Harv in Montana in the States. And you could look and say who found it, and then who dug it out. And you could follow the documentary evidence that says, well, what layer of rock was it in when they found it? And how did the ground people, I've forgotten, geologists, that's what they are, and how do they say how old those rocks are and all that sort of stuff? You could get a pretty good historical record of documents that verify what that is. This is actually its auction picture from last year, 28th of July. It went for sale. And a person who had investigated it, checked it, followed the evidence, had concluded that, yeah, definitely, this is a real Gorgosaurus skeleton, paid $5 million for it. He believed in it to that cost to him. Now, to be perfectly honest, I don't care what you think about a Gorgosaurus skeleton. I really don't mind. But I do care about what you think about Jesus Christ. First off, we need to think about that together, a much more important thing than whether that dinosaur skeleton is real or not real. So the first question, was there a man called Jesus from a place called Nazareth near Galilee who was executed around what we call 33 AD? Is that a fact? Or is it not a fact? It's not a scientific fact, because we can't weigh it, test it, repeat it. It's not like that. It's a historical fact. What do we think? Well, virtually all scholars agree that there was a man called Jesus, lived in that area, and was executed. This is Michael Grant, OBE, CBE. He's a university classics professor. This is his book about Roman coins. That's one of his areas of expertise. When he was, in his will, he left 700 Roman coins that he used to verify history to the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge. So he's a real tangible history sort of guy. And he said this: in recent years, no serious scholar has ventured to postulate the non-historicity of Jesus. I'll put that in the positive. Nobody says he didn't exist. That's not the positive either, but never mind. Or at any rate, very few have. And if they have, then they have not succeeded in disposing of much stronger, indeed very abundant, evidence to the contrary. Abundant evidence to the contrary, what does he mean? It's not a scientific test, but it's those elements of historical proof that are overwhelming for him. He can't go and ask Pilate, did you kill this guy? But that doesn't give him a problem, because the evidence is there to support it. What evidence? Well, what the witnesses who were around at the time said. What documents there are, and what consequences roll down through history. After all, as one historian has said, the origin of the faith of the early Christians remains a perplexing mystery if Jesus did not live. Now, sometimes in history we reach really surprising things, maybe even sort of one-off things. Every serious investigator believes that Jesus lived, but not every serious investigator believes that Jesus rose again from the dead. And that's, in some, well, it really is the most important bit. But sometimes in history there are moments which are really surprising, but they do happen. Jesus rising from the dead would be fundamentally surprising because we know in the evidence of our own lives that people die and that's sort of it. They don't come back from the dead. So this would be an astonishing sort of one-off sort of fact if it's true. Are there astonishing one-off sort of facts? What if I told you that the United Kingdom decided to make a car mechanic its sovereign? This is Queen Elizabeth, not Queen Elizabeth at the time, but in her car mechanic phase, before she was made queen. It's surprising, isn't it? We've only ever done it once. Charles is not a car mechanic. But just because it's an exception doesn't mean it's not true. But given that people on the whole don't rise from the dead, we would expect there to be a bit of disbelief kicking around from even the people who saw it happen. And the first people who are recorded as seeing Jesus alive after his death were some women. And with apologies to something more than half the people in the room. That was a bad move. Because women's testimony wasn't sort of accepted as legal evidence in those days. So if you wanted someone to sort of state something as a fact and to be believed, you wouldn't pick a woman. And in fact, when those women went to the other followers of Jesus and said, he's risen, he's alive, he's not in the tomb, the disciples reacted in exactly the way you'd expect them to. They said, you are talking nonsense. That's their first reaction. It's really hard to believe that someone has risen from the dead. And those people who followed Jesus around were no different to us, no different to others. It's really hard to believe. So when Jesus first appears in front of them, he says to them this: why are you troubled, and why do doubts rise in your minds? Look at my hands, my feet. It's me. Touch me and see. A ghost does not have flesh and bones, as you see I have. And he asked for food, and he ate some fish to prove that he was really there, solid, not some sort of hallucination, not some sort of ghostly spirit, but a real physical body standing in the room. You think that would be okay? Certainly helpful. But one of his closest followers, a guy called Thomas, wasn't there. And when he comes to join the others, they say, we've seen the Lord, we've seen Jesus. And Thomas says, oh, no way. Unless I see the nail marks in his hands, put my finger where the nails were, put my hand into his side, no. Will not believe. But a week later, Jesus turned up and Thomas was there. And he says to him, put your finger here. See my hands. Reach out your hand, put it in my side. Stop doubting and believe. The point is, nobody expected this. None of the disciples expected Jesus to be alive after his execution. It wasn't really part of the Jewish faith at its best even for this to happen. There was a resurrection, yeah, but in the end, when everybody would be raised, that one person out of time would be raised. Nobody expected that. So how could we possibly believe it to be true? Well, let's think about this. What's a fact? Historical tale of fact rather than scientific? Well, this is historical fact. Are there witnesses? What are the documents? What are the consequences? We've reacted to some of the witnesses, heard what they say. What about the documents? Well, what documents are there? Jesus was executed probably around AD 33, give or take a year, which is 1990 years ago, and that's quite a lot. And things were different then. There was no photography. To write anything was really quite expensive. There was no Twitter. There was no instant way to communicate stuff. So on the whole, if something really important happened, what you did was you just told people. The people you saw, the people you met, you just told them. And that's what happened first. The people who had been really not convinced, but then convinced by Jesus' presence that he was alive again, told people. And they started to spread a bit, and then people started to write things down. So it's probably the first thing that got written down was a part of a letter that Paul, one of the early Christians, was writing to a church that he visited and wanted to sort of teach, and he wrote this. What I received, I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, he was buried, he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Peter, Cephas, and then to the 12. And after that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. This is about 20 years after Jesus' death and resurrection. And Paul's writing this saying, just, if you don't believe this, ask people. Most of the people who saw him are still alive. You can still go and check. Get those witnesses to affirm this for you. Later on, some of those 12, some of those closest followers, started to talk to people, or people close to them started to write things down, write down the stories. So the first written account, somewhere between Paul's letter, as we've just seen, and probably Mark, writing his biography of Jesus in around 50. And Matthew probably followed. Some of the dating of this is all a bit, maybe a few years one way or the other, maybe a little bit later. Luke wrote his version of Jesus' biography. And then probably last of those, John wrote his record of Jesus' life and death and resurrection. So within the lifetime of those, there were at least 5 written accounts. And if you talk to an ancient historian, you say, well, we've got 5 different people writing about something that happened. It's true. It's like, was I born in Northern Ireland? It's like we've got my mum writing it, and a doctor writing about it, and a midwife writing about it, and a passing cleaner who remembered it, writing about it. It's more evidence than you would need. You might say all those people sort of believed in Jesus. So they're all biased, yeah? So they wrote down this because they wanted to tell people this and wanted people to believe it. But there are people who wrote it down even though they didn't believe. This is a quote from a guy called Josephus, written in AD 93, so a little bit later than most people believe the Gospels were written. He wrote this when writing about the history of the Jewish people. Many people among the Jews and other nations became Jesus' disciples. Pilate condemned him to be crucified and to die, but those who had become his disciples did not abandon his discipleship. They reported that he had appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion and that he was alive. And he said, and the tribe of Christians, so named after him, has not disappeared to this day. Now, this day that he's writing about, the emperor Flavius Domitian is reported as stirring up persecution against the Christians. So this was not a good day to say that you believe that Jesus came back from the dead. That got you into trouble. In fact, the evidence is that out of the original, or the 12 disciples, the 12 apostles, at the beginning of the church, all but John were executed by the Roman state for insisting that Jesus had risen from the dead. This is a bigger cost than 5 million on the dinosaur. So we've said historical facts, what witnesses say, what documents are there. What are the consequences that you might expect or see if Jesus rose from the dead? Well, there could have been no consequences at all. Like if the disciples had said that Jesus is alive, he's risen from the dead, but if someone had gone to the grave, the tomb, and brought out Jesus' body, that would have been the end of it. That's where our film started last night. But they didn't do that because they couldn't do that because the body wasn't there. But there are consequences. Tacitus, another non-believing historian, said that Christianity became a really big group really fast and really surprising. They were called Christians because different people from different nations joined together in this belief, rather than being able to be identified as Jews or, people from Thessalonica or wherever it happened to be. And something really strange happened, because this was based as a Jewish sect. Jesus was a Jewish man who followed the Jewish law, and a key aspect of the Jewish law was that you obeyed and followed the Sabbath. So on our Saturday, you gave that day to God. You did not do any work. That was a day specially devoted to God. But suddenly, it moved. The Jews that were forming these Christians, suddenly Sunday became the special day. The day that they said Jesus had risen on, transforming 1,500 years of practice. And in the next couple of centuries, the beliefs of this weird little Jewish sect were adopted by the Roman Empire based on something made up? How does that happen? Or based on the facts that the witnesses were astonished, but they saw it to be true. People wrote it down so others would know who weren't around at the time. And the consequences, well, this building, our presence, are one consequence of the fact that Jesus rose from the dead. And he basically said this: love the Lord your God with everything you've got. And love your neighbor, that's anyone else really. Sometimes love's a bit of a weird word. Value everyone else every bit as much as you value your own life. Someone asked him, which is the one thing? And he answered with these two things. So he clearly thinks they're both important. Maybe he thinks they're the same thing, really. Now, he also said some quite surprising things in terms of how to live well. Like, at one point he said this: you should love the people who are really against you. You should pray for those people who are deliberately setting out to harm you. That doesn't sound quite so wise when you put it up against how we normally think. And Jesus said that we could know how to live well just by copying what he did. He said this: anyone who hears these words of mine, practices wise. Anyone who hears them and doesn't put them into practice is an idiot. That's extraordinary, isn't it? For someone to have the arrogance to stand up to everyone who is in front of him and say, do what I say, do what I do, otherwise you're nuts. People don't do that these days unless they're mad. Yeah? But Jesus did it. And he taught people how to understand God. And again, like with some really strange things to say. He said God is like a hen longing to look after her chicks. He said God is a generous, loving, devoted dad. And he said God is really into justice. Maybe even especially for the weak and the struggling, the powerless and the poor. The thing that gets me is that God is really into justice. He doesn't take it lightly when someone does something that harms or hurts or injures someone else. And actually, I want God to be just like that. I want God to stand up for those who haven't got the strength or aren't able, haven't the power to stand up for themselves. But there is a troubling moment when I think about the times when I have done things which have harmed or injured or hurt other people. Because, if I can think of those things, I'm probably pretty convinced we all can. Then I'm in trouble. And I want God to say that I'm in trouble. Whether it was something I did deliberately, something where I was just being stupid, or maybe I just even wasn't paying enough attention to do the right thing. It's not. Jesus said that we make ourselves enemies of God if we have done wrong against him or against other people. Anyone know what this is? It's a spacecraft. It's not quite a satellite, but actually it is a sort of satellite when I think about it. The picture of the sun is in there because this is the Parker Solar Probe. Anyone heard of the Parker Solar Probe? Could be a medical device, but in this case it's a satellite. It's a spacecraft. It was launched in 2018. It's about the size of a sort of hatchbacky sort of car. Sort of mid-sized car, loads of scientific instruments on board, and a heat shield. And the heat shield is really quite important because although the sun is our source of life, it could be death for this spacecraft. Because what it was launched to do, was to examine the sun. So what it does is it got launched from Earth, and it heads in, launched over on the extreme left, and it sort of heads in and gets down to the sun and then sort of runs past it quickly before it gets melted, and then heads off in the opposite direction. But because of the sun's gravitational field, which is quite strong, and we've seen that gravity works earlier on, as it tries to escape, it gets pulled round and does a nice big sort of orbit and comes back and does it past the sun again. And it's planned that as it does this sort of oval, captive to the sun's gravity, that it does 24 passes. So it'll go past the sun 24 times, look like it's going to escape. Sometimes it's really close, and then sometimes it looks like I'm heading off and the sun will never get to me. But it always drags it back around because it's captive to the sun's gravity. And then after 24 times, the sun wins. The sun's gravity holds it captive, and it will be burnt. Which brings us to what Jesus said. He said, the Son of Man, that's a name for Jesus, came to serve, not to be served, and then to give away his life in exchange for the many who are held captive. Like the Parker Solar Probe is to the sun, so we are to death and corruption. Held captive as the inevitable outcome. And although sometimes we might be far away from death and everything might be hunky-dory, we can only know that sometimes we'll be very close. And the end is inevitable. Death has got us. There's no way out. One day, we'll die. Except Jesus, because we've said that he came back from the death. And he saw his death as different. He said he'd never done anything wrong. He'd only ever shared the life and the love of God with people. In fact, he said he was the life of God, the source of life himself. So death could not hold him. And not only that, but his death opened a way to life for us. I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live, even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Anyone who follows Jesus, who trusts in Jesus, Whether they die or not, they will never die. Now that's a bit of a claim. It's a huge claim, and you might not immediately believe it. And you're in good company, because none of Jesus' original followers believed it either, until they knew he was alive again, until they saw him after the third day, walking and talking and eating with them, once more alive. So if Jesus is the exception, if Jesus has come back from the dead, if Jesus is alive, then I probably should listen to what he says. I should probably trust what he says. That very first question I asked, the single most important fact about my life, Jesus is alive. Second question, what's my purpose in life? What's the point of me? Is to follow Jesus. So I think all our lives actually come down to this. Do we trust in Jesus or do we not? If we trust in Jesus, then we face life and death under his wing, trying to live following his wisdom, his knowledge, living with his power. Or we reject that and live according to our own wisdom, our own life, and face death alone. And that is the ultimate choice for us. It's sort of literally a question of life and death, if you want to make it think like that. So, I don't know where we all are in this room. You might be thinking, yeah, I've known this stuff, I've known it for ages. And if that's the case, then I hope it's been a little bit of a sort of helpful refresher. So if someone asks you, why do you believe that Jesus came alive from the dead? You might have some sort of evidence you want, or ways of talking about it and helping introduce Jesus to people. Maybe you don't, and if you think, it's all baloney, I'm just going to ignore this stuff because I don't believe it, then the one thing I would encourage everybody basically to do is to not reject something you don't know what you're rejecting. So if you think you're going to reject Jesus, then at least pick up one of these little books. There's a whole pile of them on the table just by the door. It's Matthew, one of the closest followers of Jesus, description of Jesus' life. Read it, and then reject Jesus if you want. Or you may be thinking, yeah, it's okay, but I don't quite understand. I've got some questions, some thoughts, maybe not, whatever. Then there's another book which is over there, which starts with Easter. It says, "Is Easter unbelievable?" And it goes through some arguments and thoughts. About halfway through the book, there's sort of a bit on the sort of facts around the resurrection in the same sort of way as I've talked about them today. It's quite interesting. Do pick it up and think about it. Or you might just want to ask a Christian you know, or maybe a Christian here, or whoever sitting beside you, or someone else. But if you've got questions and doubts, but you're not quite, don't just drop it. It's quite important. So do think about it. Get some help. Conversation usually helps people think about it. Talk to me if you'd like. Or you might be convinced. You might have been convinced for a long time that Jesus is alive again. And if you believe that Jesus is alive, and you believe that he reveals God to us and shows us how to live and has made a way through death for us, then the next step for us all really is to talk to God about it. And prayer is really very simple. It's just talking to God. Often, thank you, sorry, please is a really helpful way of thinking about it. So I'm going to stick a prayer up. And the thank you is, Jesus, thank you that you loved me enough to die for me and to rise from the dead. The sorry is, I'm sorry that I've not loved you and I've not loved other people as I should have. Sorry for the mistakes I've made, the harm I've caused. I need your forgiveness and help. And the please is, please come with your wisdom, take over my life. I want you to lead me from now on, all the way through death and out the other side, into everlasting life. I trust you. So if you'd like to, we can join in that prayer together. You might just want to say it silently. I'll read it. And if you would like to, do join in your head silently as we pray. Jesus, thank you that you love me enough to die for me and to rise from the dead. I'm sorry that I've not loved you and I've not loved other people as I should. I'm sorry for the mistakes I've made and the harm I've caused. I need your forgiveness and your help. Please come and take over my life. I want you to lead me from now on, all the way through death and out into everlasting life. I trust you.